So I wanted to give a little bit of a background to the concept of idolatry. Now, it's really one of the most significant deviations in human spiritual history. The Tanakh gives us a chronology of idolatry. And so when we understand the origins of it, that provides a very vital foundation for Noahides, who obviously are committed to upholding the prohibition against idolatry. And the Torah, along with long-standing Jewish tradition and commentary, offers a very deep narrative of how humanity, which initially knew God directly, gradually lost sight of God's unity and his singularity. So what we're going to do is explore the progression of idolatry, and we're going to look specifically at the way the Rambam records the development of it. Not only to describe idolatry and the origins of idolatry, but to illuminate the central principle of faith in the one true God, which is the foundation of the entire Torah, and the essential mistake of idolatry, the essential spiritual error that idolatry represents. Now, the Torah begins with the creation of humanity. And Adam and Eve are portrayed as individuals who had direct knowledge of and a relationship with God. We can see this from the fact that they are in direct dialogue with him. He speaks directly to them, they speak directly to him. They could not but have been aware of there being one creator of the universe. They lived in a world where Hashem's presence was unmistakable. And they were able to see how it manifested itself in all aspects of existence. In these early days, there was no concept of intermediaries, and there was no concept of an alternative form of worship. Hashem alone was acknowledged and perceived as the source of all being. And this awareness forms the basis of the Rambam's teaching in Hilchot Yisodei Torah, which means the foundations of the Torah. This is literally where the Mishnah Torah begins. So we're going to quote, "The foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there is a primary being who brought into being all existence. All the beings of the heavens, the earth, and what is between them came into existence only from the truth of his being." The Rambam is emphasizing that God's existence is unique and his existence is independent. All of creation depends on him while he depends on nothing. And this principle, which is articulated by the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 10, declares that only God is true. And God, your Lord, is true. He alone is true, and no other entity possesses truth that compares to his truth. Now, I want to be very clear on this point. It sounds like I'm speaking about there being multiple truths. That's not possible. right? The truth is one. It's singular. But I think what is meant by truth over here is what we might call an imperative existence. God's existence is something that we necessarily have to assume, whereas the existence of anything else in the universe is something that has a possible existence. In other words, that we see it, we experience it this way because this is the way Hashem chose to create the world. But the only mandatory existence there is God's. Now, what happened? Like, what happened from the time of the creation of Adam and Eve and the events of the Garden of Eden? When did suddenly it become an idea to worship not God directly, but intermediaries? The turning point was the generation of Enosh. While the first humans recognized Hashem's unity, subsequent generations began to drift away from that idea. The Torah notes a significant turning point in the days of Enosh, the grandson of Adam. And the verse is in Genesis chapter 4, verse 26. It says, Ulashet gam hu yulad ben. And to Seth a son was born, vayikra et shemo Enosh. And he called his name Enosh. And then the verse says, Az huchal likro b'shem Hashem. And although the English translation of that verse is that it was then that men began to invoke the Lord by name, there's something very interesting about the verb that is used here. Huchal shares the same root as lechalel, which means to desecrate. And Rashi picks this up by commenting on this. The Dor Enosh, says Rashi, began to worship Avodah Zarah, began to worship idols, as we know. And then he quotes the verse that we just mentioned, that he says, Az huchal likro b'shem Hashem. So what does it mean, huchal likro b'shem Hashem? What does it mean when we have a verb like that, which is similar to all verbs and all words that indicate either desecration or profaneness? A secular person in modern Hebrew is called a chiloni. A chiloni is I wouldn't want to have that moniker because it's rather pejorative, given what its root is. It refers to the desecration of things. There's the sacred, and then there's the profane. In English, when we make that kind of division, we separate out that which is holy from that which is essentially unholy. So here, what ended up happening in the generation of Enosh was that it became at that point that people began to desecrate God's name. How did they desecrate God's name? That's what Rashi is telling us, that people began to worship idols at that point in time. But how did they come on to that kind of an idea? Like where did they get that from? The Rambam continues to explain that instead of calling upon God with pure intention, humanity began to distort their understanding of him. If we look in the Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Avodat Kochavim, which means the laws concerning idol worship, The Rambam provides a very detailed account of this spiritual distortion. The generation of Enosh made a very critical error in their reasoning. They said God created stars and spheres to control the world. Now, this we know to be true, obviously. We live in the natural universe. And the natural universe is definitely guided seemingly by laws of physics, by the movement of celestial bodies, by weather patterns, by all the things that make up the experience of the world that God created and that we have been placed within. We seem to be subject to all of those natural forces. We don't overcome them necessarily. So, in a very real sense, the natural world serves as a mechanism to obscure God, to hide God. We might be subject to the natural universe, but God is completely transcendent of that. God is outside all of physical reality. God created physical reality and isn't subject to anything having to do with physical reality. But because the day-to-day experience of the average human being is that we interact with these things in a very real way, it makes our perception of God much more difficult to come by. They said he placed these things, stars and planets, on high and treated them with honor, making them servants who minister before him. Look, we know that the ocean's tide is influenced by the gravitational force of the moon. So these things are operative and acting as God's agents to guide all the various different processes that take place in the universe and in our world in particular. So these things are essentially the servants of God. Accordingly, they said, it is fitting to praise and glorify them and to treat them with honor, because doing so is an expression of honor to the king. Now, we can understand this, at least from some sense of historical memory. Most of us do not live in societies where there is a monarchy. Some of us do. I understand that the Netherlands has a king. I don't think anybody outside of the Netherlands has ever heard of him, but at one point in time, that was a very important position in the world. And not only that, but anybody who was associated with the king's ministers were people who, by association with the king, were due titles and honor and special privileges within the kingdom. In other words, you wouldn't see the king's astrologer in the street and throw a paper airplane at him, because then you'd be punished by the king. So we can kind of get our minds around this. We're looking at all these natural forces that we know were created by God and are producing the experience that we have in this world. We might come to think, we have to honor these things also as creations of God and as objects that essentially provide for the movement of things in our world. So what began as an attempt to honor God by acknowledging his creation soon turned into the worship of that creation. Temples were built, sacrifices were offered, and prayers directed to celestial and natural bodies. And these practices were rationalized as fulfilling God's will, but they marked the beginning of a profound spiritual error, which is the error of attributing independent power to created entities, independent of God. And over time, this error compounds. false prophets arose, claiming divine instruction on how to serve specific stars or images. They created rituals and declared these practices as essential to human flourishing. In other words, if you would like to be successful, you should link your destiny to this particular star, this type of tree, the wind, the gods of thunder. And as the Rambam recounts, the situation deteriorated to the point where God's name was forgotten entirely because people had gotten so preoccupied with the worship of his quote unquote servants that you had generation upon generation of people who had no other experience other than attending the temples built to any given force of nature. So the recognition and acknowledgement of the God who created the entire universe disappeared. Humanity, except for a few individuals like Hanoch, like Methuselah, like Noah, like Shem, like Aver. Other than those few people, humanity lost sight of the Creator and focused instead on lifeless idols made of wood and stone. Now, it's important to understand that idolatry is more than a mistaken belief. It represents a fundamental corruption of human spirituality. By placing intermediaries between themselves and God, idol worshippers distort the very nature of divine service. And this is something that we see in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19, where there is a warning, quote, "And when you look up to the sky and behold the sun and the moon and the stars, the whole heavenly host, you must not be lured into bowing down to them or serving them." In other words, the Torah itself acknowledges that this could be the tendency of human beings. And when we look at Jeremiah, he adds to this critique and describes idolatry as both foolish and futile. He says, they are both dull and foolish, speaking about the idol worshippers in humanity. Their doctrine is but delusion. It is a piece of wood, silver beaten flat, that is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz, the work of a craftsman and the goldsmith's hands. But the Lord is truly God. He is a living God, the everlasting King. People have a very difficult time with a transcendent God that they can't see. Right? This is a fundamental precept of faith, of Torah faith, that everybody has to hold on to. That God is completely incorporeal, has no body, is not affected by the physical world. But people have a hard time with that. They want something tangible. They want something that they can see. They want something that they feel is relatable. In a certain sense, belief in God is the ultimate challenge because it is asking the finite mortal who is bound by this existence, this physical existence, to connect themselves with an utterly transcendent, infinite, non-corporeal creator of the universe. So we see throughout history that people not able to withstand, not able to summon the inner strength to hold on to this faith, have created physical forms to serve as objects of worship. And this we see in the creation of the golden calf. This happened to the children of Israel as well. Where is this Moses guy? He's been gone for so long up there on the mountain. Where is he? We need something to sustain our spiritual energy. And seeing that that was going to get out of hand, Aaron helped them create a golden calf to direct this energy towards. But what this does is it reduces the infinite and transcendent God to finite and material forms. When we do this, we diminish, and it doesn't matter how beautiful the statue is. It doesn't matter how artistic and what craftsmanship went into creating that stained glass window, this architecture, this form. An infinite being, there's only one of them. If you think about this, you know, we see in the sources that it's very difficult for the soul to be placed in a body in this world. Because the soul, given its closeness to Hashem and to the world of truth, is rather unimpressed by this world. It's like the analogy that's given is imagine the daughter of the king is being courted by various different suitors who would like to have her hand in marriage, and they promise her all sorts of beautiful material things. She doesn't really know to accept any of their offers because, frankly, she's the daughter of the king. Anything that exists in the kingdom is hers to have. All she needs to do is ask. She already has all of that. So it's the same thing with the soul. Like, what does the soul want from this world? The soul already has everything. It's the body that strives. It's the body that spends its time on earth fulfilling its lack. So to take Hashem, the infinite God, who is the creator of the universe, who doesn't need anything, is entirely independent of us, and to try to glorify him through statues is just an incredible denigration, not only of God's majesty, but also of the human capacity for true spiritual connection. I just want to point out also that what the Rambam's talking about here is not idolatry throughout history, but we're talking about idolatry until the time of Abraham. We know about other nations that arose after that and were idolatrous. And also, you know, different belief systems that have come about since then, which are also idolatrous. The Rambam's talking about a type of spiritual error that arose in humanity very early on. Now, against the backdrop of the spread of idolatry, the Torah reaffirms the singularity and the unity of God. We see in Rambam that God's existence is fundamentally different from that of creation. He alone is true and independent, and his reality is encapsulated in the phrase that we read in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35, Ein od milvado. There is nothing else aside from him. So when we look around, we think, what do you mean? Everything here is solid and tangible. I can see myself on this Zoom chat. I can see all my friends here as well. What do you mean? There's only God. The true essence of everything is Hashem. There's this world that we live in is in many regards an illusion. We ourselves are an illusion. So that's kind of hard to get our heads around. And we are not meant necessarily to walk around all the time with that kind of consciousness because we have a mission to fulfill within the parameters of the world that Hashem created. But nevertheless, we have to be aware that there is a greater, more transcendent reality. And this idea underscores the core mistake of idolatry, which is to attribute divine qualities to created beings. Even when that kind of worship is intended as an indirect acknowledgement of God, it inevitably leads to a distortion of faith and practice because we are going to distract ourselves with intermediaries. And once we distract ourselves with them, I think it's a human instinct to want to serve something, is to want, the human instinct is to serve God. But when we have placed something in between us and God, we don't become any less desperate. A lot of people who have left religions to embrace Torah often find that thirst, that spiritual thirst, very difficult to quench because they want that relationship. But now, how do I do it? Now that I've taken myself out of the church, for example, how do I do it? I still need some way of connecting to him. And so without proper direction, without proper orienteering, people will direct that energy at something else. And it's not just, it's not just statues, it's not just Greek mythology. There are also, I think, more metaphorical ways that we worship idols, God forbid. When we think that there is anything other than Hashem that makes things happen in the world. When we a lot of people attribute to money, for example, the power that they thought their idol once had to make them lucky or make them successful. They say money makes the world go round. That's a phrase in English, but it's not true. Hashem makes the world go round. Money is a medium of exchange that we have all agreed upon. But wealth, poverty, all of these concepts ultimately have their root in very spiritual foundations, which go to the basic creation of the universe itself. It could be the worship of celebrities, rock stars, sports heroes. We treat a lot of those people in the same way that people in the ancient world would have treated their idols. And we have to be careful about that. It's not actual idol worship, but there's something wrong about that kind of directed energy. And I'm mentioning it because I think it's important just to help us develop a kind of a consciousness. Because the world provides us with so much distraction, so much noise that makes hearing that basic truth that, you know, above and beyond this this movie that we're in is Hashem, is the creator of the universe. So I have to reach out to him from beyond all of this in order to make, in other words, the way, I guess, in a certain sense, I may come to regret this particular analogy, but I think it might work. At one point in time, people understood astronomy, and this was critical for orienting themselves. People who were traveling by sea or people who were traveling by night would look up in the sky and know exactly where they were and where they were going based on the position of the stars. In fact, Shmuel, who was one of our great Amoraim, one of our great sages that we find in the Gemara, would say that he knew the pathways of the stars in the same with the same familiarity that he knew the streets and marketplaces of the town that he lived in. In order to get through this world, we need to orient ourselves to Hashem. The way, in a certain sense, the way a person would have looked up and through the astronomical information that he saw was able to figure out where he was in the world and where he needed to go. For Noahides, understanding the origins of idolatry is not merely an intellectual exercise. It's an understanding of the fundamental flaw of it, even before we get to what constitutes it, how does that manifest itself in a halachic, in a technical sense, how to avoid it, how to identify it. We need to know where this idea comes from. We have to understand the error, which again is attributing to anything other than God, power. So here we have a framework for deepening our relationship with God and fulfilling our role as upholders of monotheism. The prohibition against idolatry calls for a rejection of any and all intermediaries, affirming instead a direct and unmediated relationship with the creator of the universe. And this is your task, friends. You are tasked with preserving and spreading the message of the unity of God in the world. That's one of the great privileges that you've obtained by walking this path, by embracing Hashem's Torah. It involves not only avoiding idolatry themselves, but also educating others about its ethical and spiritual dangers. And by doing that, you continue the legacy of figures, people, tzaddikim, like Noah, like Abraham, who resisted the prevailing idolatrous culture and called humanity back to its creator. And we have to understand and use our instincts to see, how does this apply in the world that we live in now? As we've seen the origins of idolatry as we trace in the Torah and sources, reveal how humanity strayed from an initial awareness of God's unity. And through misunderstanding and misrepresentation, idolatry took hold, leading to very profound spiritual and ethical consequences for the world. But even in the darkest times, there were individuals who preserved the knowledge of the one true God. For Noahides, this should serve as a cautionary tale and also a source of inspiration. It emphasized the importance of faith in the oneness of God and the responsibility to uphold this truth, to live this way in a world that's often prone to error. You can tell this to all your Swiftie friends. By understanding the ancient past, Noahides can strengthen their commitment to monotheism, to a belief in one God, and play a vital role in guiding humanity toward a closer relationship with Him. May we be so blessed.